Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into something really complex, a deeply controversial situation that's shaken a huge part of the religious broadcasting world.
Yeah, it's a tough one. We're talking about the explosive conflict involving Joni Lamb, the Daystar television network, and some very painful public accusations from her own son and daughter-in-law, Jonathan and Suzy Lamb.
Before we go deeper into the story today, we would appreciate if you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on further stories. Also like and comment your thought.
It's high stakes, absolutely.
And this deep dive is, I think, really necessary because the sources we're working with, interviews, detailed reports, public statements from Joni's own show, Joni Table Talk, they paint two pictures that are just completely opposite, diametrically opposed narratives.
Right. So our goal here isn't to take sides, obviously, but to really unpack these two conflicting stories. We need to look past the headlines, understand the specific claims, the specific defenses, and importantly, the massive ethical and legal questions this whole thing throws up.
Especially for faith-based organizations, right?
Yeah.
Any public-facing institution, really.
Exactly. Because it's such a difficult story. At its heart, you have this terrible allegation involving a child and then this claim of betrayal by a family leader, a matriarch.
On one side, you have Jonathan and Suzy saying the ministry put its public image first above a child's safety.
And on the other side, Joni Lamb saying this entire crisis is basically a deliberate, vengeful attack aimed at destroying her and her multi-million-dollar ministry.
Just fundamentally different realities being presented.
Okay, so where do we start? Let's begin with the accuser's narrative. Jonathan and Suzy Lamb's side of the story.
Right. Their account really kicks off back in 2020. They described this initial trauma when their young daughter first disclosed that she'd been molested.
A devastating moment for any parent.
Absolutely. And the sources say initially the child couldn't identify who did it, so you had this awful suspicion just hanging over the family. For almost a year, apparently.
That uncertainty must have been agonizing.
And according to Jonathan and Suzy's account, that agonizing period ended very suddenly and horribly in August 2021.
What happened then?
They say they were on a family retreat down in Florida, and Jonathan claims he walked in and actually witnessed his daughter unclothed with another family member, someone identified in their statements only as Pete.
Wow. So for them, that was the moment, the undeniable proof.
That's what they maintain, yes. The moment of terrible realization.
So when something like that happens, instinctively, you'd look to family leadership, right? To the matriarch for help, for action. So they went to Joni Lamb.
Yes, Joni Lamb, the head of the family and the very public face of Daystar. They went expecting, well, immediate and strong support, decisive action.
And what do their sources say they got instead?
Well, this is the absolute core of their claim. The response wasn't support at all. It was effectively a demand for silence.
Silence.
Yes. They claim Joni explicitly urged them to stay quiet, to keep the whole thing within the family, and the alleged reason, to protect the ministry's image, its reputation, above everything else.
Protect the brand over the child's trauma.
That's how Jonathan and Suzy saw it. They called it a betrayal of the worst kind, those exact words. Prioritizing the Daystar brand over their daughter.
That is just a staggering thing to allege against your own mother, against the leader of your ministry.
It really is. And they maintained they just couldn't agree to that. They couldn't stay silent. They stated very clearly, their sources say, that they felt a moral obligation, a duty to God, actually, to speak the truth.
Even if it meant exposing people they loved. People in powerful positions.
Exactly, even if it meant that. And they claim that decision, that refusal to stay quiet, actually made them fear for their own safety.
Fear for their safety.
From whom? They didn't specify exactly, but they stated they didn't feel safe at home anymore, so they moved immediately to an undisclosed location, as they put it.
So they removed themselves physically from the situation.
Yes. And crucially, this move wasn't about finding some quiet, private resolution. It was about forcing public accountability. They confirmed they took their evidence, everything they had, and shared it. They gave it to multiple national reporters, including the journalist Julie Roys, who covers the evangelical world closely.
So they were basically signaling, we are going public. This is not staying internal.
Precisely. They were ready for the consequences, whatever they might be.
Okay, that sets the stage for one side. Now, the counter-narrative. Joni Lamb's response. How did she, as the head of this massive network, deal with these claims, perhaps internally at first, before they exploded publicly?
Well, when it did become public, she addressed it head on, using her own platform, her show, Joni Table Talk, and her denial was absolute, unequivocal.
What did she say exactly?
Her core message was, I never covered up anything. Marcus, her late husband, never covered up anything. Full stop.
Okay, a flat denial. But how did she explain why her own son would make such accusations?
Well, this is where her narrative really diverges. She didn't frame it as a misunderstanding or a tragedy. She framed it as an attack, a calculated effort to destroy her leadership. Yes, she called it a malicious smear campaign. And interestingly, she also described herself as a victim of spiritual warfare.
Hold on. So we go from a specific allegation about a child and a cover-up straight to Joni positioning this as a power struggle, a spiritual battle. How did that land publicly?
That framing, that pivot was central to her defense. But as you can imagine, it immediately raised eyebrows. It drew a lot of skepticism.
Because it seemed like avoiding the core issue.
Potentially, yes. And she got very specific about the alleged motive behind this attack. She claims Jonathan and Suzy were acting out of bitter and vengeful feelings, purely personal grievance.
Bitter about what specifically?
She tied Jonathan's actions directly to his resentment over being removed from his job at Daystar. Apparently, there was some kind of detailed improvement plan he refused to follow. That's her claim.
Okay, so a work dispute.
A work dispute, yes. And also, she claimed, his deep disappointment that he wasn't named as his late father's successor to lead Daystar.
So she's painting a picture of sour grapes. That this whole horrific allegation is just a smokescreen for a business disagreement and thwarted ambition.
That's exactly the narrative she presented. Business grievance masquerading as a concern for child safety.
But what about the legal side? Didn't she address the fact that there was an initial report back in 2020? What was her defense on that?
She did address that, yeah. She pointed out correctly that the initial police investigation stemming from that 2020 disclosure had actually been closed years earlier.
Why was it closed?
According to her statements, the authorities found no conclusive evidence back then, largely because, she said, her granddaughter wasn't able to share enough specific details at that time, which, can unfortunately be common with young children.
Okay. So an inconclusive initial investigation. How did she use that fact?
Well, crucially, she highlighted the timing. She stressed that the case was only reopened years later, immediately after Jonathan was removed from his Daystar job.
So she's saying, look, the timing proves it.
Exactly. She presented that sequence of events as clear proof of opportunism. Revenge, not a genuine pursuit of truth or justice.
Right. The timing argument. But let's circle back to that spiritual warfare language she used. That's a term you hear quite a bit in certain religious circles.
Yeah.
What's the significance of framing it that way?
Well, it's often seen as, let's say, a classic institutional defense tactic. When leaders face difficult allegations, especially things like family conflicts, financial issues, or critically abuse reports labeling it spiritual warfare, can be a way to try and delegitimize the accuser.
How does that work?
It shifts the focus, you see, away from the specific facts, away from potential ethical or legal failings, and onto the sort of abstract theological battle. The implication is that the accuser is being used by, demonic forces to attack God's work or the ministry.
So it bypasses the actual substance of the allegation.
It can attempt to, yes. It allows leaders to sidestep the hard questions about their own conduct, their legal duties, the actual painful reality of the situation, and instead rally support based on loyalty. Loyalty to God, ostensibly, but often really loyalty to the ministry itself, framed as God's instrument.
And you mentioned this approach drew skepticism. Did it backfire?
The sources suggest it largely did, yes. Focusing so heavily on Jonathan's alleged motives, on spiritual warfare, on protecting Daystar's reputation, many critics felt it just sounded incredibly defensive.
Not compassionate.
Exactly. There was a perceived lack of public compassion for her own granddaughter, a lack of acknowledging the sheer gravity of what was first disclosed back in 2020, regardless of the later conflict. It seemed to center the ministry's image above all else.
Which ironically is exactly what Jonathan and Suzy accused her of doing privately.
Precisely. And that perception really takes us into the deepest part of this whole situation, the collision between perhaps internal religious ways of handling things and the actual external law of the land.
Okay, let's dig into that, because this raises a fundamental question, doesn't it? Especially for you listening. When a ministry operates, say, in Texas, where Daystar is based,
Yeah.
where does that line sit? The line between handling things internally, maybe through faith, and the legal criminal obligation to report.
Well, the law in Texas on this point is crystal clear. It's absolutely unambiguous.
What does it say?
It mandates that any suspicion of child abuse suspicion, not even proof, must be reported to law enforcement. And crucially, it must be reported without delay.
So it's not optional. It's not something you can choose to handle within the family.
Not legally, no. It's not a suggestion, it's a requirement. And critically, failing to report that suspicion in Texas isn't just frowned upon, it's a criminal offense itself. It's not just a moral lapse, it's potentially illegal.
That raises the stakes considerably for Joni Lamb's alleged actions, doesn't it? Even separate from the underlying abuse allegation itself.
Significantly. Because Jonathan and Suzy's core claim, then, is essentially that Joni tried to steer them away from that legal mandate, that she pushed for a more traditional internal religious resolution, maybe what some call biblical reconciliation, which would, conveniently perhaps, protect the ministry from public scandal and legal scrutiny.
Instead of fulfilling the clear legal duty to report the suspicion immediately.
That's the fundamental conflict right there. It's systemic in some ways. You see religious organizations sometimes defaulting to internal resolution, perhaps citing theology, protecting the body of Christ, avoiding scandal within the flock.
But is it just theology?
Well, the sources, and frankly common sense, suggest there's often another layer, a fear of legal discovery, a fear of the financial consequences, the reputational ruin that public exposure can bring. And that institutional self-preservation instinct, that impulse to protect the image, can end up suppressing the legal mandate for child safety.
Which legally and morally, arguably, should always come first.
It absolutely should supersede internal traditions or reputational concerns when it comes to child abuse reporting laws.
And the impact of this conflict, this alleged failure to report and subsequent public battle, what was the impact on Daystar itself?
Oh, it was catastrophic. Immediate and devastating, according to reports.
How so?
Think about it. If an organization that built its entire brand on preaching morality, on trust, is accused by its own family members, no less, of potentially covering up abuse to protect its image, well, that moral authority just evaporates.
So tangible consequences.
Absolutely. Sources reported that donations plummeted almost overnight. Major partner churches, other ministries began publicly distancing themselves. The credibility that Daystar had spent decades, literally decades, building just crumbled. It triggered a profound crisis of legitimacy.
And beyond the institutional damage, there's the human cost. We have to talk about the question of justice delayed, don't we?
We do. It's a tragic element. If the case was, as reported, only seriously reopened years later when new information perhaps came forward, what about that gap? That period between 2020 and 2021 when the initial suspicion arose.
Could justice have been served sooner?
That's the haunting question. Could that child have been spared potentially years of living with doubt, fear, maybe even further harm, if the law requiring immediate reporting of suspicion had been followed right from the start? We can't know for sure, but the question hangs heavy.
And that gap, that delay, became part of the public narrative.
A very powerful part, yes. This whole story, mixing faith, family, power, money, betrayal, it was irresistible to the media. It became national headline news.
And those clips of Joni Lamb's denials.
They went viral. Her passionate defenses on Joni Table Talk were shared widely, but they often drew really sharp criticism online and elsewhere. For many observers, it solidified that perception you mentioned earlier, that she seemed to be using her platform, her faith identity even, to dodge accountability for what seemed like a core ethical and potentially legal failure to report.
So where does that leave us now? As this conflict continues, likely playing out in legal arenas as well as the court of public opinion, we're left with these two starkly different realities.
Completely mutually exclusive versions, really. You have Jonathan and Suzy, seemingly steadfast in seeking accountability, whatever the personal cost, and then you have Joni, equally steadfast in defending her absolute innocence, framing herself as the victim of a malicious attack, a smear campaign.
And the wider community? The viewers, the donors, the partners, they're sort of left in the middle, forced to decide who to believe, weighing complex family dynamics against the clear duties of a major public institution.
It's an incredibly difficult position, but ultimately, regardless of how this specific legal case turns out for any individual involved, this whole scandal forces a much bigger conversation, a necessary reckoning, really, with accountability.
For all public-facing institutions.
Absolutely, but especially religious ones where trust and preached morality are so central to their identity. What this case highlights is that even the appearance of hesitation, the shadow of prioritizing reputation over the mandatory reporting of suspected child abuse, That alone can cause lasting, maybe irreparable damage.
Damage to public trust, to credibility.
Exactly. It really underscores that image, what you project, and integrity, what you actually do, especially behind closed doors or under pressure, are two very, very different things.
And the cost of prioritizing image over integrity, especially when a child's safety and legal mandates are involved, it's just immense.
It truly is.
So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, to consider is this. When an organization's entire foundation rests on its perceived authenticity, on its preached values, what is the true long-term cost when its leaders appear, even for a moment, to weigh their moral and legal duties against the perceived need to protect their reputation, their finances, their empire?
It's a profound challenge, isn't it? A challenge to the very foundation of how institutional faith operates, or perhaps should operate, in the modern world.
A heavy question, but an essential one raised by this deep dive. Thank you
Yeah.
for joining us.